lot going on.
We're still in a flash flood warning.
To catch you up with what happened.
Good morning. I'm Whit Johnson in New York. We're coming on the air with this breaking news because the Supreme Court has just issued a major ruling in the Second Amendment and a gun control law created to keep firearms out of the hands of domestic abusers. The court asks if the government can prohibit people under domestic violence restraining orders from possessing guns. And just moments ago, the justices upholding the law intended to protect domestic violence victims. Let's get right to ABC News senior national correspondent Terry Moran, who's there at the Supreme Court. Terry, break down this decision for us among the justices.
It's a major decision, 8-1. 8 of the justices on board with a decision that limits the reach of the Second Amendment's guarantee of the right to bear arms. This is a Supreme Court that has been extremely friendly to gun rights claims. This case is different. This is a case involving a man who was under a restraining order for domestic violence. He had a weapon and had threatened his intimate partner with it. He threatened other people with it. He's discharged it in public. He was a danger, the court decided, and so disarmed him. He brought a suit saying that the reason he should not be disarmed is because the original meaning of the Second Amendment, back when it was passed in the 1700s, did not include domestic violence as a reason for disarming people. In this case, in an opinion written by Chief Justice John Roberts, the court rejects that argument. Roberts declaring that taken together, if you look at all of the evidence, he says, of the history of gun restrictions in this country, common sense suggests the same thing. When an individual poses a clear threat of physical violence to another, the threatening individual may be disarmed. And Roberts and the other justices who write go through the history, and what they're saying is essentially it doesn't have to be a one-to-one match, because clearly domestic violence was not a big issue in the 1700s. It was considered a private matter under law. Times have changed, and this case says that, yes, even under the Second Amendment, gun laws can change as well, with the principle being that people who are dangerous individuals found to be threatening others can be temporarily disarmed.
Terry Moran for us, thank you so much. Let's bring in ABC's senior Washington correspondent Devin Dwyer. And Devin, of course, this case brought by Zachary Rahimi, a Texas drug dealer who had a restraining order against him from his ex-girlfriend. He was challenging the ban as lacking historical precedent. Explain what that means in the context here.
Well, the Supreme Court, which just a couple years ago said, as Terry was talking about, that gun laws in this country can only stand if they have a historical analog years ago, back to the founding. And what Zachary Rahimi was saying here is that back several hundred years ago, there was no such law, no such ban on people like him. What the Supreme Court did today, though, is said that, in fact, it doesn't need to be that strict, that there can be a broader tradition of disarming people who are a dangerous threat to the physical safety of others. And I got to say, Whit, this is a big win for the FBI and the background check system. They tell me that since this law was in place in 1994, it's prevented the sale of 77,000 guns to people under these orders.
Wow, significant numbers. Devin Dwyer, thanks so much. We appreciate it. Let's go to ABC's legal contributor, Brian Buckmeyer. Brian, just tell us sort of the sweeping implications here and what this means from a practical standpoint for law enforcement and people who are trying to own these guns, who shouldn't.
Yeah, absolutely. So we're going to look both to the historical context, but also, as Devin was pointing out, the broader context of what we're trying to do when we're trying to ensure that the proper people are having firearms and not individuals who might be convicted felons, have warrants, might have open cases that don't allow them to have guns because of restrictions or because of substance abuse. And so now we're looking at this rule that came from Bruin, a case in 2022 out of New York, that created a standard of looking at the historical context to the direct letter of the law, but also the spirit of the law. I think that's what's coming through here, the idea of trying to keep citizens of all walks of life safe in the United States.
Brian Buckmeyer, thanks so much. Let's bring in our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas. And Pierre, I know you have some other statistics to add here, but this really struck me from Johns Hopkins Center for Gun Violence Solutions. A woman is 5 times more likely to die from a domestic abuse situation if a gun is involved. That very much part of the question here.
This is an enormous relief for advocates for domestic violence victims. So far this year alone, 952 people have been murdered with guns involving domestic violence. Last year, over 1,900 people. So this involves lots of people who have been living in fear, who now will know that the restraining orders can keep people from having guns that have been, in many cases, abusing them.
Pierre Thomas, our thanks to you and our entire team. Again, that breaking news, the U.S. Supreme Court upholding the ban on guns for people under domestic violence restraining orders. We are going to return now to regular programming. For some of you, that's Good Morning America, and our coverage continues here on ABC News Live and abcnews.com. Then I'll be right back with our entire team at World News Tonight later this evening. For now, I'm Whit Johnson in New York. Have a great day.
This has been a special report from ABC News.
Hi, I'm Diane Macedo. We are following that breaking news from the Supreme Court. The justices have just upheld a ban on guns for people under domestic violence restraining orders. This is the court's first Second Amendment case since they expanded gun rights in 2022. The justices ruled in favor of that 1994 ban on firearms for people under restraining orders to stay away from their spouses or partners. ABC News senior national correspondent Terry Moran joins me now from outside the Supreme Court, along with ABC News senior Washington reporter Devin Dwyer and ABC News Supreme Court contributor Kate Shaw for more. Terry, this was an 8-1 opinion authored by Chief Justice John Roberts. Justice Clarence Thomas dissented, and Thomas is saying here, Roberts is saying here in part, we conclude only this, that an individual found by a court to pose a credible threat to physical safety of another may be temporarily disarmed consistent with the Second Amendment. Walk me through what sticks out to you from the way Roberts structured this opinion.
Well, that's a great question, Diane, because the key word in there is found by a court. Roberts is not saying that legislatures can now pass laws disarming people who have restraining orders. This man, Zaki Rahimi, was under a federal restraining order for domestic violence. His intimate partner, had filed that, worried for her own safety. And his lawyers brought this case saying, well, you can't take away his gun on that basis because when the Second Amendment was passed in 1788, 89, there was no such thing as laws prohibiting domestic violence. It was considered a private matter, and no such thing as restraining orders preventing it. And so this law, this federal law, which disarms people temporarily while they're under a restraining order for domestic violence, is not consistent with the history. And over the last few years, this court has said the only gun regulations that matter are those where you can find that historical analog at the time of the Second Amendment. So this case, 8-1, really represents a pause in the victory march of gun rights advocates through this court. This is one where they put the brakes on, where this was just a reach too far. Chief Justice Roberts does find in the history analogous laws that disarm dangerous people, and he said that if a court finds that someone is so dangerous under a domestic violence situation that they must be temporarily disarmed, that is consistent with the Second Amendment. It's a big case.
And Devin, we're already starting to see reaction to this case coming in. What are some of the statements that are sticking out to you? I see Everytown for Gun Safety just issued a statement.
Yeah, a number of gun rights groups have been praising this decision, Diane. They expected that the Supreme Court was going to uphold this ban. In fact, during the arguments, I was in the room. It was almost common sense to many of the conservatives, even those who robustly believe in the Second Amendment, that this should be in place. But it's how they did it here in the way that Terry was talking about it that's almost as significant, Diane. In fact, I'd liken it to a bit of a course correction for this court. Justice John Roberts, the Chief Justice, writing that some lower courts have misunderstood what they mean, and that the precedents he has talked about don't have to be set in amber. There does not need to be an exact identical match, he says, to some law in 1791 for it to be identical. And so this is, in fact, the court doing a bit of a course correction to that bombshell decision in 2022 saying that only regulations that had an analog in history could stand. Today, Chief Justice John Roberts making very clear that the court is saying the Second Amendment is not unlimited and that there can be some reasonable assumptions made in looking at the tradition in the United States. And today the court said there is a tradition of disarming potentially dangerous people who pose a threat to others.
And I want to bring that point to our Chief Justice correspondent, Pierre Thomas, because, Pierre, you come on, unfortunately, fairly often on this network to talk about gun violence in this country. What does this decision do for the fight against that?
Well, it has enormous implications for advocates for domestic violence abuse, people who've been abused, victims. Here in this country, so far this year alone, Diane, 952 people have been killed with guns in domestic violence situations. Last year alone, more than 1,900 people killed in domestic violence situations involving guns. So these restraining orders, in which a court has said this person has been abusing this other person that is someone close to them, can now be banned from, purchasing a weapon. That's what it was about. It's a sigh of relief for many people, many women in particular, who are abused and then are fearful that their significant other is going to go out, get a gun, and then kill them.
And I want to bring in our legal contributor, Brian Buckmeyer. Brian, what kind of precedent could this case set based on the way the justices phrased this ruling?
Well, in terms of this law, it's been pretty new as in terms of looking at the tradition of gun rights laws in this country and trying to see whether or not they fit that constitutional framework. That was only a rule in this country since 2022 in a case called New York State Rifle and Pistol Association against Bruin. We just call it Bruin because it's such a long name, made this rule. Now we have a greater refinement and looking at not just the letter of the law, but the spirit of the law when people are trying to restrict gun access. There also seems to be a component that in restricting the guns from people who have these restraining orders, there need to be some form of due process, some form of notice and a hearing. And so now it seems like going forward, either laws that provide for that notice and that ability to try to get that gun back or have it lost will be maintained as constitutional so long as there are simple processes and also the spirit of the law of restraining certain people from getting guns fits the tradition, not so much the letter of the law fitting the tradition.
And, Brian, that 2022 Bruin ruling, it triggered some chaos in the local courts. There was a flood of suits that were then brought in, challenges to gun safety laws. What do you think this ruling does in terms of trying to clarify where this country stands on those kinds of gun laws?
Well, I could say as both a former public defender here in New York as well as a federal attorney here in the Southern District and Eastern District of New York, defense attorneys, like you said, flooded the courts and said, okay, if we need to find a specific tradition to show why my client's gun rights were restricted or taken away, I see none here. Now I think prosecutors and judges, and also defense attorneys to some extent, will have to understand that it's broader than just looking for a specific letter of the law. Was a restriction then? Can we have a restriction now? Now I think it goes broader to, is there notice, is there due process, and is this restriction going more to what I would call broadly just the spirit of the law, trying to ensure that people who are violent and potentially violent don't get guns. The question for me is now things like, do drugs involve that as well? Because we also restrict people who use drugs from getting guns, and what else goes to the spirit of the law and not necessarily the letter?
And Terry, Justice Clarence Thomas wrote the dissent here. He was the only dissenting opinion, and he really focused on the nation's historical tradition of firearm regulation. Break down his argument here.
Well, his argument is that you cannot find a similar law or a similar tradition or attitude at the time the Second Amendment was passed back in the late 1780s. And since there was no historical analog back then, you can't impose it now. For Justice Clarence Thomas, for decades, he has said that doing something like that is taking power for the court itself, rather than leaving it to the people to decide the boundaries of the right of to keep and bear arms. That has been his clarion call in the Second Amendment. He's had a winning streak on that in this court over the past several years, but not today. And one of the interesting concurrences, one of the interesting opinions here is by Justice Amy Coney Barrett, appointed by President Donald Trump. She sides with the majority. It's an 8-1 decision, and she begins her opinion by saying the Second Amendment is not absolute. It codified a pre-existing right, and pre-existing limits on that right are part and parcel of it. She reads history in a much broader way, in a much more interpretive way, and she says if you look at it that way, then you can see the founders, the people who wrote that amendment, wanted to disarm people who were dangerous and irresponsible and unlawful people. And this ban on people who are under restraining orders for domestic violence fits that squarely. It was a very interesting opinion, almost a declaration of independence from Justice Barrett, from the kind of originalism that Justice Clarence Thomas talked about in his dissent.
Devin, this ruling also comes after last week the justices struck down a ban on bump stocks, which essentially make a semi-automatic rifle fire like an automatic one. What do you make of the contrast in these decisions, striking down the ban on bump stocks, but in this decision upholding this ban on guns for those found to be domestic violence abusers or with restraining orders in domestic violence cases?
Well, two significant cases involving guns for sure, Diane, but very different legal questions at stake in both of those. The bump stocks case involved an interpretation of federal law since 1930 and whether that device actually met the definition of a machine gun. Here, this case today just decided is a Second Amendment case dealing with the right to bear arms and whether those under these types of restraining orders still have that constitutional right, even when there's been a determination. So today's case and this decision, 8-1 by Chief Justice John Roberts, upholding that ban that's been in place since 1994, much more significant both because of what it says about the court, which has come under so much criticism for its Second Amendment jurisprudence, now making very clear that dangerous people should not have guns, but also laying out this modified test, as we've been talking about going forward, saying that it is not a free-for-all when it comes to gun rights in this country, and that regulations that are steeped in the tradition of the United States can stand and should stand, as this one did today.
And Pierre, I know you've spoken a lot to advocates for domestic violence victims. What's the impact for them from this ruling?
Well, Diane, when I spoke to some advocates for domestic violence victims a couple years ago for a project I was involved in, the thing that struck me was the tension, the fear of someone who's being abused, beaten, hit, and wondering and worrying if that person that is doing the abuse is somehow going to get access to a gun. And as Devin talked about earlier, over 70,000 people have been blocked from purchasing guns who were domestic violence abusers, deemed to be by a court, with these kind of restraining orders. So again, the human aspect is we cannot overstate, of people living in fear who've been abused and beaten, now knowing that laws that can restrict their loved one or associate from going out and getting a gun is still in place.
And Brian, there's an interesting part of this decision where the justice writes, some courts have misunderstood the methodology of our recent Second Amendment cases. How do you think they're trying to use this decision to sort of course correct and clarify here?
Yeah, I think in this decision, not only that line, but other lines as well, as a big megaphone to all the other lower courts, both federal and state, that this is what we meant in that Bruin case from 2022. And I look into this one quote where they say that, as described in Bruin, that you can not necessarily look to the precise language to match from a previous text or historical text, but you can, quote, still maybe enough to find analogous case or situation that will pass constitutional muster. And I think that's what's going on here. They're saying there might not be that issue or that case that's on all fours or completely similar to this, in that, hey, we couldn't see why we restricted people with domestic violence orders or restrictions or convictions in the past, but we're doing it today. But the court says we restrict certain guns from being possessed that didn't exist many decades or centuries ago today. And similarly, we can restrict access to guns that we have today based on the spirit or analogous concept of the laws of trying to protect its citizens and people of this country.
So, Terry, what's the big takeaway here, and what other key decisions are you watching for from this court for the rest of the term?
Well, the big takeaway here is that really it is back to the drawing board on how to interpret gun regulations under this opinion now. That case from a couple years ago, the Bruin case, said you got to really almost have a stapled historical analog, a rhyme, something almost identical to the gun regulation you're looking at today in the 21st century. This case opens up more interpretive room, and that will cause some confusion in the courts. They're going to get more gun cases because of that, but they will be not solved quite as easily as I think the court believed when it struck down the concealed carry regulation in New York in the Bruin case. Now, what are we looking for? Well, the biggest case of the term has yet to be decided, and that is President Trump's claim that because he was president, now and forever, he is absolutely immune from any criminal prosecution for any acts he took trying to overturn the 2020 election, because presidents, he says, are immune from prosecution for their official acts, and he was acting officially. That's the biggest case. That'll have an impact on the election as well as on presidential power going forward. And there's that big abortion case out of Idaho. This is the first test of a state's ban on abortions since the court overturned Roe versus Wade back 2 years ago. So those are the two big ones left.
All right, Devin Dwyer, Terry Moran, Pierre Thomas, Brian Buckmeyer, thank you all. And we will have continuing updates right here on ABC News Live throughout the day. More news right after the break.
Why do so many people start their day here?
From ABC News, this is Start Here.
To be in the know and get a different take on the day's top stories.
A lot of news today, so let's get into it.
Listen now to the Daily News Podcast honored with 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards and see why the New York Times calls it a news podcast worth listening to. Start Here, ABC News. Make it your daily first listen.
Now, that's a part of the story I bet you didn't see coming.
Wherever you get your podcasts, Start Here.
Welcome back to ABC News Live. First, we have breaking news. The suspect connected to the murder of rapper Tupac Shakur is expected to make bail. Court documents obtained by ABC News showed Dwayne Keefe D. Davis has enlisted a bail bonds company to help cover the $750,000 bail 9 months after his arrest. Once he posts a sufficient portion of that, he'll be able to await trial from house arrest with electronic monitoring. Davis is facing murder charges for allegedly being the shot caller in Tupac's 1996 drive-by shooting. He has maintained his innocence in court. And it's time for The Drop, where we talk about the big music headlines of the week. ABC News contributor, DJ and radio personality Megan Wright is here to break it down for us. Megan, what do we need to know?
All right, let's get to it. You know I have to start with Kendrick. Kendrick Lamar popped out and showed y'all on Juneteenth in Inglewood, California, and it was a historic moment for hip-hop with West Coast rap's finest. Everyone who's anyone was in attendance, as well as both sides of LA's gang divide, showing a united city. Video is even circulating online that Northwest was in the building, but let's talk about who wasn't there. Rapper The Game is speaking out, addressing his absence from the pop-out concert after being trolled for not being there. He went on IG Live and then posted the 17-minute video on Instagram talking about his place in West Coast rap history, as well as saying that the show was amazing. He also gave Kendrick his props for bringing people from all backgrounds together on stage. Now, somebody else who wasn't there was also Snoop Dogg, who in the past mentioned, you know, Drake and Kendrick are both his nephews, and he's not getting into the middle of it. Now, let's talk about another show I want to see, or actually another tour. I can't wait for it. Missy Elliott. She's hitting the road with Sierra, my homie Busta Rhymes, and Timbaland. Now, it is so hard to believe that this will be Missy Elliott's first headlining solo tour, but in a recent interview with Variety, she said, look, I just woke up one day like, I want to go on the road, and now she's going. Missy's musical career kicked off in the early 90s as a part of an R&B girl group called Sista. She then did features and emerged as a solo act with her 1997 debut album, Super Duper Fly. Known for her iconic music videos, insane creativity, and genius flow, the Grammy-nominated artist has 6 certified platinum albums. But the last time we saw her on the road was, get this, during Beyonce's Dangerously in Love tour in 2004. And here we are 20 years later. The 24-city North American tour kicks off July 4th. Busta, if you are listening, I need to go to this show, all right? Now, from one concert to the next, let's talk Global Citizen Fest. Artists like Post Malone, Doja Cat, and Jelly Roll are set to hit the stage, and Hugh Jackman is hosting. The concert takes place September 28th and is a free event. Now, according to Rolling Stone, this year's show show will aim to drive action and encourage governments around the world to increase financial support for anti-poverty programs, protect and restore the Amazon rainforest, and improve equitable access to healthy food, stronger healthcare systems, and education. Now, you know I always end with a viral moment, and today's comes in form of a podcast. After actor Ben Badgley appeared in Ariana Grande's The Boy Is My Music video, we now get to hear Ariana on Pen's podcast called Pod Crushed. Now, during their chat, fans noticed and, took to TikTok and all forms of social media to talk about a sudden pitch change in her voice when she went from a lower tone and then shifted to a higher register. Now, this moment, of course, again, posted all over TikTok, and Ariana even jumped into one of the comments and replied and said she's always done this, citing vocal health, adding, "I intentionally changed my vocal placement, often depending on how much singing I'm doing." So basically, Ariana said, leave me alone. I've been doing this, all right?
Back off and let me do my thing.
Yes.
Megan Wright, thank you, friend. Have a great weekend.
You too.
And thank you at home for streaming with us. I'm Diane Macedo. ABC News Live is here for you anytime with the latest news, context, and analysis. You can always find us on various streaming services, the ABC News app, and of course on abcnews.com. The news never stops. We'll be right back.
Babe Ruth, Hank Aaron, Shohei Ohtani, legends of the game. But now the list of greats redefined. From ABC News, Reclaim the Forgotten League, a side of the story of baseball you have never heard before like this. The award-winning podcast is back. Listen wherever you get your podcasts or scan the QR codes you see here.
Reporting from Burlington, Vermont, right in the heart of the path of totality. Wherever the story is, we'll take you there. You're streaming ABC News Live.
There is a price to be paid every time a survivor shares their story. I will not be silenced.
Do you feel the church accepted abuse?
I wouldn't say accepted it as so much pretended it didn't exist.
Yep, that's him.
Yep.
Ready? Kira Phillips with ABC News. Does your church protect sexual predators?
The powerful new Impact by Nightline. Secrets of the 2x2 Church.
There's nothing pretty about hearing this.
Now streaming on Hulu.
They call him the Beauty Queen Killer. He's targeting young women in malls.
I am single. I want to enjoy the company of a member of women.
He tortured me.
How did she survive 9 days of terror?
The word accomplice came up.
Nobody knows the real story.
The Beauty Queen Killer, only on Hulu.
Let's go.
The ship is incredible. It feels like living in a science fiction movie.
We just saw what no one has seen before.
Wow, look at that.
Oh my gosh.
Well, dead ahead. Hang on!
We are heading into the unknown.
Hammer, hammer, hammer. It doesn't get any more cutting edge than this.
First thing in the morning.
There's a lot going on.
We're still in a flash flood warning.
To catch you up with what happened overnight. Police in riot gear arresting dozens of protesters.
What's happening today? Escalating tensions in the Middle East.
What people are talking about. The migrant crisis.
Fast, straightforward.
With some fun in between.
Check out the Gator on the 17th hole.
The buzzkill in baseball.
First thing in the morning.
America This Morning.
America's #1 early morning news.
On ABC News Live.
Welcome back. Scandinavia can be one of the most expensive places to visit in Europe, especially right now. The solstice kicks off the biggest holiday of the year in the region, but joining that midsummer celebration doesn't have to break the bank. ABC's Maggie Rulli is in neighboring Estonia to show that same charm at a very different price for this week's Bucket List on a Budget.
Medieval cities, beautiful nature, and temps that don't break the thermometer. This is Estonia, right across the Baltic Sea from Stockholm and Helsinki.
One of the other great things about Estonia is when the rest of Europe is baking, Estonia is going to be relatively cool and moderate in temperature. And Estonia overall is just much cheaper than anywhere else in Scandinavia or Europe for that matter.
We start in the capital, Tallinn, one of Europe's most well-preserved medieval cities, a UNESCO World Heritage Site. And its charming old town is free to explore.
I totally fit in.
You can also buy the Tallinn City Card at about 20% less than Stockholm's for $45 a day.
With it, you get access to more than 50 museums and cultural sites, as well as public transit. Let's go.
At this pace, I need caffeine.
Then Tallinn's known for its thriving cafe culture. And here, I get to have twice as much because a cappuccino costs just $2. That's about half what it would be in Stockholm.
Recharged, we head out to Estonia's countryside. To get there, you'll need a car. You can normally rent one here for about $60 a day. In Stockholm, the same ride would cost you $120. And all of this is just 30 minutes from the city.
Hiking trails like this one crisscross the entire country, some as long as 500 miles. And nature here is always free.
And if you're feeling brave,
we're going bog swimming! Woo! Rain or shine, Estonians enjoy their nature.
thankfully, they also love their comfort.
And just like Scandinavia, Estonians know how to do cozy well. A summer fire, these coastal views, it's perfect.
Tucked away in this beautiful landscape, here you can find luxury Scandi-style hotels on a budget.
This is a mirror house, and it's built to seamlessly blend into the nature surrounding it. It is so cool. Now, here in Estonia, a place like this goes for about $200 a night. In Sweden, it would be $600.
After a day in nature, it's time to relax with a traditional favorite.
And like their Scandinavian neighbors, Estonians love to sauna, and you can check out a public sauna for as little as $10.
And sauna goes so well with spa.
Relax, Maggie. Here in Estonia, an hour-long massage normally costs well under $100. It'll be double that in Stockholm.
Estonian culture is on full display throughout the year. Plan your visit in the winter and experience Tallinn's Christmas market. Or like us, for summer solstice and midsummer, where the whole country stops to celebrate the midnight sun.
And Diane, today here in Estonia, we get nearly 24 hours of sunlight to celebrate. Now, midsummer is known as a magical time of good fortune and healing. So from this gorgeous medieval town square in Tallinn, Estonia, back to you in New York, Dan. We are sending you all of the midsummer good vibes.
We are sending you lots of jealousy and envy right now. Maggie Rulli, have a great time, Maggie. Thank you. And thank you for streaming with us. I'm Diane Macedo. ABC News Live is here for you anytime with the latest news, context, and analysis. You can always find us on various streaming services, the ABC News app, and of course on abcnews.com. The news never stops. We'll be right back.
Whenever news breaks,
we are here in Israel, a nation at war.
In Rolling Fork, this tornado tore through this town.
From Lewiston, Maine.
The scene of a horrific mass shooting.
From the scene of that deadly missile strike.
ABC News Live everywhere.
In Iceland, let's go.
On the 2024 campaign trail.
Here at 10 Downing Street.
Wherever the story is.
We're going to take you there.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live, streaming free everywhere.
I'm Diane Macedo. We have breaking news. The Supreme Court is upholding a ban on guns for people under domestic violence restraining orders. In the 8-1 ruling, Chief Justice Don Roberts writes, an individual found by a court to pose a credible threat to the physical safety of another may be temporarily disarmed consistent with the Second Amendment. ABC News senior national correspondent Terry Moran joins me from outside the Supreme Court, along with ABC News senior Washington reporter Devin Dwyer, ABC News Chief Justice correspondent Pierre Thomas, and ABC News legal contributor Brian Buckmeyer for more. Terry, this decision reverses a ruling from the Federal Appeals Court in New Orleans that had struck down that law. So what do you make of how Chief Justice Roberts phrased this opinion, and what kind of impact is it expected to have nationwide?
Dan, this is a big case. This draws new limits on that Second Amendment constitutional right to keep and bear arms. You remember a couple of years ago, there was a case out of New York involving a concealed carry regulation. The Supreme Court struck that down, saying the only regulations that we will uphold are ones that are, quote, consistent with our nation's historical tradition of firearms regulation. So in this case, a man who had been under a restraining order for domestic violence was indicted by the federal government for possessing a firearm. There's a federal law that prevents people who are under restraining orders for domestic violence from owning a firearm. He challenged that, saying that is not consistent with the Second Amendment, as the Supreme Court has said it was. And in this case, 8-1, 8 justices agreeing that the Second Amendment can disarm people who are dangerous. Writing for the court, the Chief Justice, John Roberts, saying, when a restraining order contains a finding that an individual poses a credible threat to the physical safety of an intimate partner, that individual may, consistent with the Second Amendment, be banned from possessing firearms while the order is in effect. Since the founding, our nation's firearms laws have included provisions that prevent individuals who threaten physical harm from having firearms. So this is a big case that now draws a line in an area that seemed pretty wide open, the meaning of the Second Amendment's right to keep and bear arms. And this comes as good news to women and others across the country who fear weapons, firearms, in the hands of their abusers.
Pierre, what kind of a response are you hearing from the law enforcement community?
Well, the Attorney General just put out a statement praising this decision for the very reason that Terry just mentioned, that for so many victims of domestic abuse, this will be a sigh of relief. We're looking at some numbers just this year alone. Over 950 people have been killed in domestic violence cases involving guns. Last year, more than 1,900 people killed in domestic violence situations involving guns. In other words, someone was being abused, the abuser got a weapon and then killed that person. In many conversations with people who advocate for domestic violence victims, I've been struck by what they've had to say about living in fear and worrying that the abuser will somehow get access to a gun. This is a great balm of relief for many of those people.
And Devin, we just saw those stats on the screen. The Gun Violence Archive says 952 domestic violence murders involved guns so far this year. I know you've spoken to victims of domestic violence. How significant is this ruling to them?
This is a very personal and emotional decision, Diane. We did interview a number of women who had suffered at the hands of an abuser who had a weapon. In fact, I spoke to Lachey Craychan, a mother of two from Louisiana, who said she wished she had gotten a restraining order against her ex-boyfriend at the time. It was a harrowing ordeal, and here's how she described it.
He shot me behind my head and in each hip, and I fell right next to my daughter. And my great aunt, she was just like, oh my God, he killed himself, and she was at the door.
They didn't think you were going to make it.
Yeah, I was just bleeding so much, I could feel the blood.
Do you think if he had been subjected to a domestic violence restraining order that maybe he wouldn't have been able to get that gun?
Yes, I do. I do.
And that episode with Lachey happened just before the law was passed in 1994. And since that time, Diane, the FBI tells me it has effectively stopped the purchase of more than 77,000 firearms by people who were under domestic violence restraining orders at the time. So it has worked, supporters of this law say, and it will continue to work now that the Supreme Court has upheld it.
And Brian, Justice Amy Coney Barrett writes in her concurring opinion that the Second Amendment is not absolute. How significant is that, and what kind of precedent will this case set?
Yeah, so she's right in that the Second Amendment is not absolute, and that we both from a modern and traditional standpoint, we limit weapons. There are weapons that exist today that did not exist some 100, 200 years ago that have limitations on them. But I think in terms of precedents, the most important quote that I read out of this, at least as a defense attorney, is that a court must ascertain whether or not this new law that might be challenged either today or going forward is, quote, relevantly similar to laws that our tradition is understood to permit. And it continues on by saying, applying faithfully the balance struck by the founding generation and modern circumstances. And so I think going forward, we're going to have a lot of courts look and say, okay, what does it mean to be relevantly similar? And does this new law have some sort of basis in the tradition of trying to limit guns from certain people for the protection of all in a way that we can understand from modern society and how these weapons in modern day USA might negatively affect or apply to us as individuals or as a society?
All right, Terry Moran, Pierre Thomas, Devin Dwyer, Brian Buckmeyer, thank you all. And the first presidential debate for the 2024 election is now just 6 days away. Newly released federal filings show former President Trump's campaign outraced President Biden's by more than $60 million last month. ABC News senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott joins me now for more on the campaign. Rachel, we'll talk about the money and the impact of it in a second, but how are each of these candidates preparing for the debate?
Yeah, these are two very different candidates, and I think that their approaches to how they are preparing for this debate really do reflect that. And so you have President Biden. He is hunkering down right now at Camp David with a team of advisors. We are told that his debate prep is being led by his former chief of staff, Ron Klain. And we're told that the president is also going to participate in these sort of mock debates for 90 minutes, mirroring what is going to happen in less than a week. And then you have former President Donald Trump. There is really nothing traditional at all about what the former president is doing. There is no attack lines that are being rehearsed. There is no pivots that he's planning for. Instead, what he has held is more than a dozen policy sessions, and these are taking place with former advisors, current advisors, as well as many Republican allies, including some senators that are on his short list to be a possible running mate, like Senator J.D. Vance and also Senator Marco Rubio. Diane.
And Rachel, how critical are these fundraising numbers to the campaign trail in general? Does this put more pressure on President Biden going into this debate?
You know, in a lot of ways, I think these fundraising numbers do sort of show the strength of former President Donald Trump coming off of that conviction. He was convicted on 34 counts of falsifying business records. There was a question on whether or not that was going to sort of dim the support from many of the people that are supporting him. And what we have seen is that the former president has had some pretty big fundraising numbers after that conviction. And as he's awaiting sentencing, just remember he's going to accept the Republican nomination for president just 4 days after he's sentenced on July 11th.
And Rachel, the candidates agreed to having this debate without an audience. Each candidate's microphone will also be muted when it's not their turn to speak. And they'll only have a pen and a pad of paper and a bottle of water with them. How's that different from past debates? And what's behind these changes?
Yeah, I mean, just look at the photos that we were just showing there. You saw the live studio audience that was sitting there. So this is going to look and feel a whole lot different for those that are watching the debate, but also for the candidates that are going to be on that stage, because they won't have that live studio audience to feed off of if they deliver that punchline that they're hoping for and they get that sort of applause that carries them into the next question. They're not going to have any of that. They're not going to have any staff interactions once they get on the stage. They can't bring any props with them, no pre-written notes as well. So they're really going to have to rely on all of the debate prep that they have been preparing for now for weeks once they get on that stage. And then, of course, the big thing here is the muted microphones, right? So the candidates' microphones are only going to be turned on when it is their turn to speak. You remember those past debates that have turned into shouting matches between President Biden and Donald Trump? I think many people are looking to avoid that this time around, Diane.
Yes. I do wonder, though, will the lack of an audience in the studio make it harder to read, you know, for lack of a better term, who's winning the debate if you can't tell how, you know, certain lines delivered are landing with a live audience there to react?
Yeah, it's going to make the polls after the debate really, really interesting. And of course, we'll be right back out in the country talking to voters to see how this all settled with them. But that's going to be a very notable thing because it's going to be hard to tell.
All right, senior congressional correspondent Rachel Scott, thank you. And Israel is ramping up its offensive in Rafah as tensions flare with Hezbollah on Israel's northern border. Now, Israeli officials appear to be looking ahead to the end of the war and what comes after. Foreign correspondent Tom Sufi Burridge has more from Tel Aviv, Israel. Hi, Tom.
Yeah, the situation on Israel's northern border with Lebanon, Diane, seems volatile still. We're seeing from Hezbollah about 5 attacks into northern Israel today. The IDF saying it has used airstrikes into southern Lebanon and artillery too. We're also seeing from the IDF indications that in the last 24 hours they have ramped up their operation in Rafah in southern Gaza, potentially moving into northern and western areas of that city. And that's significant because only this week a top commander of the IDF told me that potentially that operation only has weeks left. And, you know, we've seen the sort of discussion about the end of the war, what next, coming out into the open a bit more. That same spokesperson from the IDF telling an Israeli media organization that, you know, suggesting basically that there needs to be more of a plan from the political leadership here in Israel about what happens after the war. And actually, we're seeing this morning, Diane, another interview from Prime Minister Netanyahu on a news website. And for the first time, he seems to suggest that Arab nations should be involved in potentially administering Gaza after the war. Now, his comments are relatively vague. What exactly he would mean, how that plan would work, we're seeing no indication at all that any Arab nation would be willing to do something like that. I think most people would agree that it would be highly unpopular for most Arab nations back home to be seen to be cooperating with Israel inside Gaza after the war. So whether that plan is workable or not remains to be seen. And look, you know, at the moment we're seeing a lot of pressure, I think rising pressure throughout this week on Prime Minister Netanyahu about the war. The war is dragging on. There's no sign that the war is about to end. What comes next? There's no sign that ceasefire negotiations to get the hostages out, to end the war, to get that ceasefire are making any progress right now. Diane?
All right, Tom Sufi Burridge in Tel Aviv, Israel. Thank you. And 13 states from Kentucky to Massachusetts are bracing for dangerous heat this weekend. In the Northeast, the extreme temperatures are even impacting Amtrak train lines. And the heat's also triggering air quality alerts in parts of the country. ABC News meteorologist Greg Dutra is in Central Park for us with the latest. Greg, what's it like out there now, and what can we expect this weekend?
Does it show, Diane? Do I look a little dewy at this point? Yeah, it is certainly very hot here. We're at 86 degrees in New York now. The heat index is at 89. New York does have a heat advisory out for today. And this is the second day that we've hit 90 degrees in a row, and we've got a third one on the way tomorrow, and that makes it a heat wave. Let's take a look at what we do have going on across the nation, because this is a widespread thing where areas are breaking record high temperatures. For example, Manchester, New Hampshire yesterday hitting 99 degrees in New Hampshire. Oh, the White Mountains are there. That doesn't feel like a White Mountain temperature. 98 degrees in Hartford, Connecticut. Augusta, Maine was at 97 degrees. Scranton at 95. And then, of course, other spots in Pennsylvania hitting 90 degrees plus. And look, this heat dome here is providing lots of alerts. As Diane mentioned, 13 states in portions of some sort of heat advisory. We've got excessive heat warnings. You see those two little pockets of the fuchsia color? That's for Pittsburgh and out to Fort Wayne. Pittsburgh, for example, that's like the highest level that you get of a heat advisory. Pittsburgh could hit 110 with their heat index when you factor in the humidity. Air quality alerts up across a good chunk of the nation too, and that's not just for particulates, it's for ozone, which really gets going, especially in times where it's this hot, because it converts vehicle exhaust a little bit more efficiently over to ozone, and again, really decreases the air quality. Now, that big heat dome, along the northern edge of that, there's some storms, and you can catch relief from the heat from these storms, but the problem is these storms keep training over the edge of that heat dome, and that's creating not only severe weather with damaging winds, large hail, and a few tornadoes possible across portions of the upper Midwest into southern Minnesota, but also flooding rains. Again, those storms, they just stay over the same spots. It's like railroad tracks for these storms, and you get storm after storm and 2 to 4 inches of rainfall forecast locally in northern portions of Iowa and into southern Minnesota, then back into South Dakota too. So where do we go from here? Well, lots of areas are in the middle of heat waves. They're going to see records that haven't been set in some 15 to 30 years, including portions of the Northeast. When you look at areas like Philadelphia, they're going to be at 9 days in a row by the time all is said and done. And July, not looking much cooler. That heat dome looks like it's going to stay around, much warmer than normal temperatures for a big chunk of the nation, from New York City down to Tampa and Miami, out to Chicago, and then a big chunk of the desert Southwest too, feeling warmer than they normally do. And normally they're in the 110 to 110s this time of year. So Diane, very hot and not going to change for any time soon through the July 4th holiday.
All right. Well, lucky for you, Greg. Dewy is the look now. You know, you're glowing. It's glass skin. It's a whole thing. You're on trend.
Well, That's good. I made a huge mistake going long sleeves, though. I may have to cut these off and go the shirtless look for the rest of the
I mean,
newscast.
that is a look that I would like to see. Maybe we'll see if someone can ferry you out a fan or something.
Oh, that would be nice. All right, thank you.
All right, Greg, thanks. Coming up, your Amazon deliveries are about to look different. Why the company's ditching those plastic air pillows in boxes and what they're using instead. Business headlines are next.
Whenever news breaks,
We are here in Israel, a nation at war after that brutal surprise attack by Hamas.
On the ground in Ukraine, reporting from Lewiston, Maine.
The scene of a horrific mass shooting.
ABC News Live is right there everywhere.
From the scene of that deadly missile strike in Dnipro, Ukraine. Reporting from the earthquake in Turkey.
In Rolling Fork, this tornado tore through this little town.
From the most devastating disaster in Hawaii.
From Charleston, South Carolina, on the 2024 campaign trail.
In Iceland, let's go.
Traveling with the president in Mexico City.
Wherever the story.
From the front lines from southern Israel. Outside the Gaza Strip. In Beirut.
From the FBI.
Reporting from the nurses on the picket line.
Here at 10 Downing Street in London.
Streaming live to you.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is.
Wherever the story is, we're going to take you there.
You're streaming.
ABC News Live.
ABC News Live.
You're streaming ABC News Live.
ABC News Live, streaming free everywhere. America's #1 streaming news.
First thing in the morning.
There's a lot going on.
We're still in a flash flood warning. To catch you up with what happened overnight. Police in riot gear arresting dozens of protesters.
What's happening today? Escalating tensions in the Middle East.
What people are talking about. The migrant crisis.
Fast, straightforward.
With some fun in between.
Check out the Gator on the 17th hole.
The buzzkill in baseball.
First thing in the morning.
America This Morning.
America's #1 early morning news.
On ABC News Live.
Why do so many people start their day here?
From ABC News, this is Start Here.
To be in the know and get a different take on the day's top stories.
A lot of news today, so let's get into it.
Listen now to the Daily News Podcast honored with 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards and see why the New York Times calls it a news podcast worth listening to. Start here, ABC News. Make it your daily first listen.
Now, that's a part of the story I bet you didn't see coming.
Wherever you get your podcasts, start here.
Welcome back. Your Amazon packages are about to look a little different while McDonald's is looking to bring back customers with $5 value meals. So are consumers loving it? ABC News business reporter Alexis Christophers has more on that and your other business headlines. Alexis, what are you watching today?
I'll tell you what we're not loving are higher home prices right now. Yeah, I found out this morning that home prices hit a record high last month despite falling demand from would-be home buyers. According to the National Association of Realtors, the median existing home price jumped nearly 6% from a year ago to $419,300. Now, at the same time, home sales fell for the third consecutive month during what is typically the busiest season for home buying. High mortgage rates are preventing current homeowners from selling, causing an inventory crunch that is leading to bidding wars and higher home prices. Well, they're a familiar sight in Amazon packages, those plastic air pillows designed to cushion products being shipped to consumers, but that also end up in our landfills. Well, now the world's largest online retailer says it is close to replacing all of its puffy plastic pillows with recycled paper filler instead. Amazon says the move marks its largest plastic packaging reduction effort in the company's history. It will eliminate nearly 15 billion plastic air pillows a year. And we finally know what will be included in McDonald's $5 value meal. Beginning Tuesday, you can get a double cheeseburger or chicken sandwich, small fries, 4-piece nuggets, and a small soft drink for $5 for a limited time. The fast food giant also rolling out free fries Friday. Say that fast 5 times. A free medium fry with any purchase of $1 or more. That's only available, though, through the app. McDonald's isn't the only chain letting you have it your way. Burger King is offering the Your Way meal. That's a sandwich, fries, nuggets, and drink for $5. And Wendy's announced a $3 breakfast meal that includes a sandwich and potatoes. It all comes after an outcry from consumers in recent months with dollar menus disappearing at fast food chains combined with that rising inflation. But remember, limited time only at all of the chains.
All right, good to know. Alexis Christophers, thank you. And remember, if you have any finance questions for Alexis, just leave a message on our Instagram feed at ABC News Live, and she might answer your question right here on Thursday. Coming up, GMA Lifestyle contributor Lori Bergamato joins us for The Right Stuff with her favorite sunglasses just in time for summer. The Right Stuff is next.
What does it take to be the most watched newscast in America?
An operation to capture ISIS fighters.
Is this our Combat Operations Center?
We're approaching the gate now. Militants came in from 4 or 5 different directions.
Operational nuclear reactor.
So you have a couple loaded and ready to go. The house is destroyed, but the flag, there's not a tear in it.
Not a tear in it.
How important is this label right here, Made in the USA? Look at your smile. You're proud of this.
I love this.
Great work.
Hi. Where are you? Where are you? Appreciate you.
Thank you. David, good to meet you.
Ismail?
David.
David.
Yes, yes. I'm David Muir.
I know who you are.
You
I watch
do?
you every night.
ABC's World News Tonight with David Muir is America's most watched newscast.
I'm Anthony Mackie. Like most fishermen, sharks used to terrify me. If the shark gets too close, I should hit it in the nose.
Well, you don't need to hit it.
I'm on a quest to find out why these apex predators,
That's amazing.
are swiping fishermen's hard-earned catches. What? You saw that? Shark Beach with Anthony Mackie.
Woo! That's our fish. Look at that.
Part of the sharkiest 4-week celebration this summer. Shark Fest starts June 30th at 9 on National Geographic.
Why do so many people start their day here?
From ABC News, this is Start Here.
To be in the know and get a different take on the day's top stories.
A lot of news today, so let's get into it.
Listen now to the Daily News Podcast honored with 4 Edward R. Murrow Awards and see why the New York Times calls it a news podcast worth listening to. Start Here, ABC News.